Hi everyone, David Cross again. And in this series of videos, we're going to go through the IP control setup, some fundamentals of IP control, kind of the basic concepts of what we do in terms of networking and subnetting and IP addresses and how we manage that, and then how we interact with the different services, DNS, DHCP, importing IP addresses, and spreadsheets and so forth. So there's a number of things that we're going to be doing in this series. I'm not quite sure at the beginning what the end's going to look like and how many series will be in. So it could be very long or it could be short. We'll see how we go. But to kind of start with, you should have your executive set up. We already have a DNS set up. We have the automation appliance set up and or have done so, and we have a login to IP control. So we want to go in as that default user in IP control, and you should be at whatever version and screens um, and support that you had in your installation. So if you went through any of the patches, you're probably at build 47 or you're somewhere near there. What you're going to see in the main screen here is the portal, admin portal, and a few things will have like the version screens. Most importantly though is the IP control documentation screen. Here you'll have access to the user's guide, the CLI API guide, which we'll go over in some details, and other things like disaster recovery, setting up replication, and so forth. So keep that in mind and access to it at all times. And our support desk here. So if you need to go to our support site, you can send email to them to open up a ticket or go to your customer portal to do so. If you're in an evaluation phase, one of the engineers, your local sales team, myself, or others would be assisting you, and we would address the TAC on your behalf. So to other begin with, we won't go through the portal yet. We'll come back to this. The application itself is broken out into three main areas of the tool. So IPAM, DNS, DHCP. In some areas and markets, you might want to flip that to get DDI. And we kind of look at this as being the primary, the IPAM, which includes various things of organization and how you organize networks and subnets. So the key concepts of IP control that we want to begin with are going to start with a concept called containers. And we also want to look at another concept that involves policies. So they kind of interact together and you kind of need to have one before the other. So you need to have some concept in mind of how you want to organize and structure data, how you want to tag information for networks and subnets, and how much detail you want to get down into for user definable fields and those functions and capabilities. So there's quite a bit there to do. So we're going to look at three key areas, and those are going to be basically what they call block types. And then we're going to go take a look at information templates and user-defined fields. And we're going to do some core things here that are going to help us along before we get into some of the navigation structure and so on. And then once we're done with this, we'll go in through the container setup, and I'll have some visual information to kind of show us what we're looking at here. So kind of to begin with, we have the block types. And again, this is under tools and the policies. And to begin with, we start with a block type called any, which is really the root. It's a default. And blocks are effectively hierarchical in nature. So if I had an any block, which I'm going to go ahead and keep this defined, it can have children, which might be geographical areas that I'm going to have networks that are assigned to a block for a region. And then it might have a child, which might be another block that represents its voice or data capacity or something, and or a third type. And those are hierarchical in nature, and we can define basically policies that enforce strict allocation of blocks, how they're defined in the hierarchy, from a policy, or we can be very flexible in this nature and just kind of allow you to, free form work with the application. Now, I prefer just to kind of through evaluations to see how things work is to prefer to start with a concept of it's kind of free form, but I do like to have some basic setup in mind. And the easiest way to do that is to kind of represent public and private addresses. And that's, pretty much everything everybody can agree with. Internal IPs for RSC 1918 and external for external management. So let's just go ahead and we're going to create two new types, and I'm going to keep them as parents. I'm not going to have them parent to any, and any is a special type anyway. So I'm going to leave it as private as the root. Of this type, I'm going to go ahead and select this because I want it to be in regression and maintain history, and it can have multiple interface types. I'm not going to go through the other values here, but know that you have policies that can dictate what available sizes are available to administrators when you define these types. And lastly, in this type, as we define new ones, and as we have built out containers later down the road, if we add new types, you can then assign them to containers at the time you define the blocks, and it kind of simplifies the process. So just to move quickly, and because we don't have any other containers here, I'm going to go ahead and just define these two as the top. So we're going to do private and public. And we're going to keep this as the top level as well. I'll go ahead and check it, although it won't change. And we're going to keep it so that all the blocks are only maintained in the in control tab at this time, or in control container at this time. Now, underneath these types, I might also then want to have data, which will represent maybe the VLANs. And I'm going to put this under private, and we're going to separate these as well. And here we'll do the same. And then let's do one more. Well, actually, let's do, yeah, wireless, since that seems to be a rather large one. And that one also has a parent of private, since it's going to be private than public, yeah, etc. So without more talking there. And then from a public capacity, I don't think there's much that we need to define. But if you had externally, you might want to define that you have maybe a hosting types of networks or subnets external if you're a service provider or MSP. So externally, you might have some type of types that are allocated to this that you would manage. So we'll just go ahead and flag it this way and do it that way. Okay, so hierarchically, I have basically a private block type, and it has two children, and those are going to be data and public, or data and wireless. And those types are then later going to be used to help me define how are these subnets used? Are they data subnets or wireless subnets? You know, just kind of a way of looking at that. The other policy that I'm going to go ahead and set up, and under Tools, Policies and Options, there's a number of policies that we can define here, and we'll kind of walk through these as we get to each section. But the one I'm looking for here is I want to have allow allocation from same container. And this is going to allow us to do what we call have a flexible allocation scheme. It's not going to require that I set up what they call aggregation or summarization ranges, although I can. It's just going to allow me to flexibly allocate my blocks, and we're going to do this for simplicity purposes. I'm not going to go through the rest of these here, but we are going to come back to it. Okay. So secondly here, so I have those block types defined. I've set their policies initially. The other thing I want to do is set up an information template. And the reason I want to do this is all throughout IP control, you can have user-defined fields assigned. User-defined fields are meta fields, and they can be imported at the time you create the data or subsequently set up during the time you're using the UI and so forth. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and create one for each of the different areas. So I'm going to say container UDF. I'm just going to submit these. All I want to do is create the template at this point. Then I'm going to have networks, network UDF. Let's just keep it consistent. And then let's do aggregate, not that I'll use it, but this could be assigned. And then let's do subnet UDF. And then here I'm going to do two different types. Let's do server UDF, since that might have some meta fields later for devices. And let's do asset UDF for devices. And I think that should be good. We'll go ahead and keep it at those. So these are what they call user-defined field templates. And what we're eventually going to get to as we start to identify what fields we want to create and assign, when we go in and define the user-defined field, we can associate that field to one or multiple templates. But by having the names ahead of time, various imports and configuration screens can now reflect this. When we're ready to add the fields, we'll drop them in there and they'll then be inherited in the displays. So just a real quick way of setting things up. And at that point, we should be able to go ahead and do some more basic concepts here and dealing with the containers. All right, and I know you're jumping at the bit to go right to the networks and subnets. That's typically what everybody wants to immediately jump into, but we need to take one step back, just like we do with the block types. And as you think about how your networks are assigned, we also need to think about how your networks and subnets are organized. And what I mean by that is the container concept allows us to organize your V4 and V6 networks, of which we have a patent, in a hierarchical fashion, and to allow you then to assign policies around how they're provisioned, what types of blocks or subnets can be capable of allocation, and access for administrators. But it also gives you the ability to logically define in your network um, all of the different sites and all of the different logical components that might represent your sites and your headquarters and other things along the lines. So I have effectively set up a tool that I have that allows me to kind of look at things hierarchically and to load our export container format into a graphical viewer, and I can create these. So I have in my test system effectively different organizational structures. I have a global organization, which might represent your company. Within there, I might then have corporate networks, maybe say these are global network links and sites and things across the continents. You then might have, say, a cloud environment that you manage for AWS or Azure, Oracle, BT, and then your external carriers in each of these states and cities and countries. You might have different providers that give you redundant links into your internet and or are your internet providers if you're not going through, say, BT, MPLS, or others. So you might want to represent their networks, and these would basically represent public type information of how you can structure it. Now, further in the way that we can organize and structure data is it can be of any depth. And what we mean by that is, hierarchically speaking, it goes, the parent, child, parent, and down through the list. And each one can be representing a site. So I have now the Americas and basically geographic regions, Asia Pacific, EMEA. And under America, I then have it broken down into basically states or regions or facility areas that I know I have sites. And within each of those regions, I can then break it down into sub-regions, down into the physical site if they're large enough. And then I can set up even automation and things around how this is all created at this point. So as you can see, it can get rather large and you can get, into depth. So make it as simple as possible, but know that you can have a very complex and well thought out plan, and you can import this information like I have this file here to do that. Now, we're not going to do that in this point or in this phase. We will come back and do that through an import at a later time. But I hope you get the concept and hope you can kind of visualize how your organization structured. It might be very flat, where you have just the data centers, then to your subnets. You might have one building, you might have thousands of buildings. However you organize it, think about it logically, and then also think about how this translates to your network allocation. And what I mean by that is when you get into summarization. If your network, 10 network and is organized at the top level, you might then have a range of networks in your 10 that's available just internally. It might be broken out into 3 different regions because you might have internal serial pairs or loopbacks connected to each site. And then you might have it aggregated for Americas and all the different regions, and that's summarized in IPControl. It's even further summarized down into the state. So we're kind of carving up the network all the way to this point, and then really getting down into the site where you're building the subnets. And you're actually building out the concept of here's where I'm going to assign a new subnet, manage the IP host. We did all of this just so that it logically makes sense into what we're trying to build. Okay, so think about that as you're structuring it, and also think about how we think of networks and subnets in that capacity. And so we don't have this video running a couple hours. Let's go ahead and jump right into this. So in the containers, to build containers, there's a container view to view them with the data, and then container maintenance to maintain them. So click container maintenance under management. And here we want to click on in control, which is our root level container. This would be the great grandparent of everything. Okay, so the root of everything we add. From here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kind of create what I have in my lab here. I have basically a logical structure, and I'm going to create this as, say, the region, which I had in my site. And I'm going to do Southeast is where I'm from. We'll do Southeast region. And here at the container level, I don't know that I set up the container level. I did not. Let's go do that real quick. Then we're going to jump back to this. I don't think I did. Yes, I did. Okay. So let's go back to container maintenance. And I just didn't see it. It went by too quick. That's very clicky if I'm using a mouse wheel here. Be careful of yours. I do want to maintain history records. So when I allocate networks and subnets, historically speaking, I want to track that data. Now, if you're getting into Microsoft sites, different conversation, but we'll get to it eventually. We do have an interface to domain controllers and sites and the representation of how this container would be represented in an Active Directory site. I'm not going to do that here. And then from the name of this container, again, I'm going to go do this in Southeast. Give it a description. Southeast region. Now, under valid block types, remember we created those different types. I'm going to disable any at this point. But really what I want in the Southeast is I want aggregated blocks. Okay, so our root blocks are effectively going to be in control. But at this level, I might also want to create a private block that I want allocated to the Southeast region. I don't want the public there. And I only want private to be at this region. Okay. Now, under valid device types, I can go ahead and leave these defined, but under tools, you can go in and create your own device types and naming policies for those types. We'll get to that as well. Allow root block creation. At this level, I might want to allow the private root block to be created here somewhere in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and allow it. And allow out from allocation. The only thing I want it checking up and in control is for the private space. Everything else is going to be disabled. Now the block type information scheme then says at this container that I'm building, what user-defined fields are going to be enabled. So here, this might be a network UDF, right? Or it might be an aggregate, which in this case, it will be an aggregate. Now I can set the others here as well if I anticipate those or leave them empty. And I don't expect to have any IP addresses assigned here, so I'll leave this as that as well. Now, when you create this, you'll see the hierarchy does not refresh automatically. There is a refresh here, so you can click it. Now, to go to the next level container, I want to go ahead and do add child block. Again, I'm going to do logical, and then here I'm going to do Georgia, where I'm at. And I want this also to be a container UDF, maintain history. And the valid block types here, I want to have also just to have the private, because I want this also to be an aggregate, all the different types. Root here, again, I might want to do private in Georgia if they have just a local scheme. And allow from allocation, I just want private again. So I only want it checking for private space at this point. And here I'll do the same, and we'll do this is an aggregate, and we'll keep the subnets. And then lastly, I'm going to expect that within Georgia I have a couple of sites. So this next container will just kind of represent my site here. And we'll do ATL VO 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's say this is virtual office 4. And here I want to have also the container UDF, maintain the history records. But basically at this site, what I want to do is start looking at subnets. So I don't particularly want the private block here, but I do want public, or I'm sorry, the wireless and the data, because those are my two types supported. Device types the same. I'm not going to allow any root blocks here in my private site, although that's enabled up in Georgia. And from an allow allocation, if I don't have any space locally, the only block I want it to check against is the private block. And I'll go through some of that as we get into the network allocation scheme, which we're coming up with. And then for the types here, because we're going to use data, I'm going to go ahead and use subnet UDF perhaps, but I could have different types for these as well. Same thing for the wireless, and we'll get down to subnet UDF. And then lastly, for the devices. whichever devices I expect to be used here. So server, we'll use server subnet, and then things like switches, we'll use the asset. VPNs, asset, unspecified asset. We'll have to define what these are. Printers, we can do a different one for these, and we won't use the others. Okay. All right, so that's a real basic structure to begin with. And we can do other things here too, such as attaching a DHCP server. If we wanted to limit a server only to a container or subset of containers, whenever we define scopes, only those scopes would be applicable to that server within that range. And then we can also attach network services, which I'm going to come back to here shortly. So in the setup, we're going to go ahead with a basic container. And my idea behind this then is that here at my site, I want to go ahead and create two different root networks. So the very top level network, I'm going to go ahead and define first a 10 net that I'm going to use. And at the, well, I do need to change this. So let me go back and change the management container. Let's go back to container maintenance real quick. I did not set the public and private as valid root blocks here in this setting. I only want those to be set up here at this level. So let me jump back to that screen. So let's try that again. So here at the root block, I want to go ahead and create the 10 net. And I'm going to create this as private, set that hierarchy. And I'm going to use the fully classful, but I can do this in different class. And we'll say, this is the root .10 network. And its status at a root network or network level is always aggregate. As we get into the children, you'll see it differently. Now, if you're managing the in-added ARPA or you're adding new networks to your design, we can, at this level, because we can do this at the network level, we can define a root network for the in-added ARPA, or basically the reverse zone. If you're managing reverse zones down to the subnet level, it's very common. This would not be the way you'd want to do this. But if you are managing one single file for the whole root, we can go ahead and define that. Now, I'm going to go into a whole nother discussion about overlapping. We cannot overlap this by building it in the IPControl container. But if I wanted to build, say, a regional level for northeast, south, west, west, I could set up overlapping so that each of those regions could have an overlapping network. And at that time, I could turn on the address space. I'm going to go ahead and turn that on at some point, and you'll see that my company wants me to make some changes. So here also, we can go ahead and do things like the RSC 1918. Doesn't do anything, but it does allow you to track that. And you can also set up a custom allocation reason, so you can go up to reason allocation to define, why are you allocating this? And so those settings are, allowing you to set that up to, track additional codes and things like that. So we're going to go ahead and set this here. Now, if you're using the cloud, which we'll also have a definition of later, you'll see the different cloud providers that you might want to define. All right, so for our private space, here's our network, and this is how we're going to work with that. Now, from this root network, this whole /8 is free, so I want to go in and basically add a child block. And in this child block, I want this also to be private, and I want this to be, let's say, a 16 that I'm going to allocate to the southeast region. The first time I allocate a block, nothing else is assigned, so there's this fully contiguous /8 available for allocation. Now, that may not be how your network is actually used, and I'm sure it's not, but the way we see it, because we've only defined one, that is how it's used. So the first time we do this, or allocate a block, it always shows the very top level block. I want to go ahead and go ahead and use that 10/8. I could select it, but I'm going to just leave this here manual and give it a block name, which will default to the block address and the CIDR block size. Give it something else if you want. And the status, I'm going to make this an aggregate. So this is going to say for the southeast, this 616 is going to be used for everything. And again, I can go through other reasons, set this up for, reverse domains and descriptions and so forth. It's pretty simple. I don't need to do anything else. We'll go ahead and hit submit. Now in Georgia, there's this 10.0.0.16, and in Georgia, I might only want a subset. I might have Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama. So I'm going to go ahead from this 16, and I'm going to allocate, I expect to have, say, a 20 in this region. What I'm now going to see the very first split is I took this 1016 and the first allocation, we split it in half. The first half we used in and started allocating and splitting it until we came to a size that I could split for those other allocations of the 16 and so forth. So what we now see are all of the available free block sizes that have been rolled up to their largest sizes, and then all of the smallest block sizes. And what IPControl tries to do is match one of the blocks, if it did this automatically, based on the size. So if I had a /20 available, it would preference that 20 automatically. I have a 16, so it's going to take one of these 16s to do that split. The address space, manually, I could just go ahead and we're going to select the first best fit, 20. Okay. And here I'm going to tell this also that's an aggregate, and I'm going to go ahead and just leave that alone. So I now have basically a tree that, and I'm going to refresh this, you see this, that now starts with a 10/8. Southeast is given a 16 of that 8. Georgia specifically is given a 20 of that 8. And then I can now go in and provision subnets, which would be called child blocks. And here I would be presented with my types. So I want this now to be a data subnet. And because I enabled the flexible allocation, I want IPControl to give me the next available. I want to say this is, VLAN 1, 2, 3, 4, ATL, VO. Just to give it the name and description. This one will be in use deployed. Now you ask what are the different types. In use deployed now is going to allow us to manage the individual IP addresses. Now once this is done, I'll have a link that I can click through. In use fully assigned is just basically fully assigned. It's provisioning the subnet. It might represent an extranet only to identify it, but we don't care about the host. You can reserve it for future use and come back and mark it as in use deployed. Or aggregate, which basically has been summarizing the range and carving out the network space we're using at a lower site level. Now also note too, I don't have any IP addresses or user-defined fields at this point, but when I had selected the type, if there were any fields available in this template, it would show those fields below the default fields you see on the screen. So now, in terms of primary subnet, this just allows you to check for, I think in Cisco and other DHCP server vendors, they use this tag, and it helps them determine from a network link the supernetting. We don't need to really do that here. Some service providers, as an example, do use non-broadcast. So this would give you the ability to provision the 0 address of a subnet, not typically something you do. And you would also see and can provision the broadcast address, which then allows you to track that information. However, in certain cases like a /31, you do need to use that IP, and this then allows that capability. So if you have to manage /31s, you might need to enable that on that particular type block. Right? We're not, so we don't need to enable that. And from the other policies here, though, we started getting into the subnet policies related to the gateway. So I could go in, if I knew the default gateway, assign it. If I knew the primary and also failover DHCP, I only have one at this point, so it defaults to it. I can set the WINS IP address. I can also go in and set other types of policies for DHCP, and we're going to come back to these momentarily, and also subnet policies, either using a template or subnet specific that I would add only to this individual subnet. But while we're here, let me click through one of these options, and you'll see that we have, in certain cases, a policy checkbox that's the same as subnet policy. That setting for those options means it can be defined here in this policies tab. So you can create a single template setting everything that's common to that template and say inherit it from same as subnet and then define those values here. The forward domains allows you then to set up any kind of DNS. What are the DNS domains that would be used as a default domain for static IP addresses or other allocations in the subnet, and or which ones would be available to the dropdown to the administrator. So if you had specific settings at a subnet level, you could do those here. and then also reverse domains and DNS servers. Okay, so I just want to, I'm going to go ahead and just click through this so we can quickly see how we've done this and how we can see the tree of this. So now that we have a subnet assigned, I can actually go in and click through that subnet, and I get down into the individual IP addresses. Each one can be clicked on individually. As status, meaning it's allocated, will show you some information here with a type descriptor. And when you click on Add IP Address, you'll be presented with various options of type, how to start, like from the subnet start or subnet end, randomly picking an address or manually assigning an IP. We can say the first one's going to be a router. We can go ahead and say it's static in this case, but you can restrict this to DHCP reserved or static in allocation. Our device types, we're going to say this is our router in this case. And with our DNS domains, I don't have one yet. You do see the root here. We're not going to use that. We're going to have to come back to this and show you that, which we'll do here shortly. And then some other options for description, operating system, the dynamic ID, and if you want to get into interface names, like if this were Ethernet 0 instead of default, we say Ethernet 0. We can say whether or not this is part of a discovery. We may want this to be pinged or SNMP discovered or not, and we can exclude it. We can also define multiple interfaces. So we can say that if this were a multi-homed IP address, it might have a different interface like Ethernet 1, and it might have an IP address in a same or subnet, different subnet, and so forth. Now, this is not necessarily how you would associate HSRP type virtual interfaces to routers, but more along the lines of how you would do this with a subnet. So keep that in mind. The discovery will automatically create an interface type for the router, and we'll show you that shortly. Now for DNS resource record, once I have a valid domain selected and I have a valid host name, these two are used together, it will automatically create a DNS resource record. At a minimum, it'll create the AMPTR, and then I can further create an alias. And if I get down into a Cisco switch, I can do a discover of the ports to determine the interface and the port level. So I'm going to hit submit just so we've completed this IP assignment and we've kind of seen how that works. And in terms of the views now of what we see, if we click back on IPControl, the top level, in the container view, I see basically whatever's assigned in this container. There's a box here to show things outside that container and effectively the free space. And what this then shows us is the hierarchy of here's the parent block. And from this parent block, I've allocated one aggregate, the /16, and it shows that the rest of the space was used and rolled up as free space. And it then splits this, as I mentioned, a 16 and works its way down through its 8. So it actually, when it split an 8 into two 9s, took one of the 9s, split it down until it found a 16, and then used one of the halves of the 16. Okay. So this gives us kind of that view. And if I click down on Southeast now, you'll see here Southeast, and I've allocated 20 into Georgia. And if I look at Georgia, I'll see that it has the 20 aggregate, which is then summarized down into the subnet. And this subnet's then used deployed. And here I can look at the quick view of the IP addresses, or I can go into the subnet properties to change values. Okay, so that's real quick IP address management and getting started. And I think I'm going to stop the video there, and then we'll come back in and talk on some of the other concepts. And I think the next one, I'll go through a real quick discovery video showing you a device container and how you set that up and discover the device. Great. See you in the next video. Take care.